My name is Pio D'Emilia. I'm the Professional Activities Committee co-chair, and I'm moderating today this event. I don't think we need to introduce neither the situation, neither our guest speaker. He came here maybe a month ago, exactly a month ago, along again with the Ukrainian colleague. And at the time, the situation was still, so to say, under construction, under diplomatic efforts. Now the situation has exploded somehow. So we are very pleased to have him again and to have him explaining the position of Russia on this situation. We will start with his introduction, and then as usually we will start Q&A from the floor and from online colleagues who are following in online. Thank you very much. Please check again your mobiles, put it on silent or turn it off. Thank you very much. Ambassador, it's your turn.
Good afternoon, dear Pio. Good afternoon, dear members of the FCCG. It is a great honor for me to speak here today, exactly as Pio have just mentioned, the second time within a month. And I'm very grateful to you for your interest, for your readiness to listen to our position, our arguments with regard to the current situation. Yesterday, Russia, in accordance with the decision of President Vladimir Putin, launched a special military operation. And the main purpose of this operation is to protect people of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, who for 80 years have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. By the way, this genocide and this humiliation have been completely ignored by the United States, by the NATO member states, by the Western states who are now trying to sharply criticize Russia. We will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. It is not by accident that regretfully, I have to mention this word, to denazify Ukraine, because unfortunately, the Nazification of this country has gone very far. And it is very demonstrative that every year Ukraine, along with the United States of America, is voting in the UN General Assembly against a resolution deploring glorification of Nazism, a resolution presented by Russia and like-minded states. Now in Ukraine, unfortunately, they glorify not the heroes who liberated Europe from Nazism, but Nazis' collaborationists. Well, and we also seek to bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against the citizens of Russia. But it is not our plan to occupy the Ukrainian territory. We are acting also to defend Russia from the threats to our national security, coming from NATO's expansion to the Russian borders and military exploration of neighboring Ukraine to gain a military foothold on its territory. The problem is that in territories close to Russia, a hostile anti-Russia was taking shape. More to this, recently the Kiev regime started hinting at a possibility of obtaining nuclear weapons in cruel violation of the NPT. We act in accordance with the Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, with the permission of Russia's Federation Council, the upper house of our parliament, and in execution of the treaties of friendship and mutual assistance with Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. I'd like to, at the same time, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that within all these recent decades, Russia has been trying to settle all the problems by political and diplomatic means. We reminded our counterparts on the necessity to observe the principle of indivisibility of security endorsed in the OSCE on the top level back in 1999 in Istanbul Declaration, Istanbul Charter for European Security. This principle, the principle of the indivisibility of security, stipulates that no country should ensure its security at the expense of security of other states. Again, this principle was confirmed on the top level within the OSCE with the participation of all the NATO member states, Russia, Ukraine, etc. We presented to the United States and the NATO several fundamental proposals on ensuring European security, on legally binding guarantees of security in Europe. Regretfully, these proposals were ignored. Our repeated messages to Kyiv and its Western handlers about the need to stop the violence and genocide in Donbass and to implement the Minsk package of measures have fallen on deaf ears. Because for them, the people of Ukraine and the people of Donetsk and Lugansk are just bargaining chip. Even after Russia recognized the independence of these republics, the shelling on their soil by the Ukrainian armed forces not only didn't stop, but even intensified. Given these circumstances, a decision, a forced decision, as President Putin underscored yesterday, was made to conduct a special military operation designed to stop the tragedy in Ukraine, which began after an illegal regime change in Kyiv as a result of a violent coup in February 2014. At the same time, we hope that there is still a chance to return to international law and international commitments. As we take measures announced by the President to ensure the security of our country and of the Russian people, we will always be ready for dialogue that will return us to justice and to the principles of the UN Charter. The basis of our policy is not to damage the interests of Ukrainian people. It is to defend the Russian citizens and our country itself from those who took Ukraine as a hostage and tried to use it against us. Again, no occupation will be conducted. The future of Ukraine shall be decided by the Ukrainian people. Actually, that is all what I wanted to tell you in my opening remarks. So I'm ready for your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Allow me to start this question and answer and warm up a little bit the debate here. As I said, we had the Ukrainian ambassador a couple of hours ago. And he insisted very much on a point that I think everybody understood very well, that one thing is to intervene in Donbass to protect the citizens of the Russian citizens, the Russian people, and another thing is to bomb other part of Ukraine. What is your comment on that?
As I told you, there are two purposes of the special military operation we launched yesterday. First is to protect the citizens of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics who have been suffering from apparent and cruel genocide conducted by the Kiev regime, the genocide that was completely ignored, if not endorsed, by the Western countries who were pursuing their own political and military interests with regard to Russia. The second purpose, the second task, is to ensure the security interests of Russia, which have been damaged greatly by the expansion of NATO in military infrastructure and number of the member states of NATO within the recent 30 years. And within the same 30 years, we have made many attempts to settle these issues on a mutually acceptable basis and have presented a lot of initiatives to reach this goal. And at the same time, as one of the co-sponsors of the Minsk agreements, we were trying actively to persuade the Kiev government to implement, to realize, to carry out its obligations in accordance with the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, all of these efforts were either rejected or ignored by our counterparts. So, from that point of view, in these circumstances, we launched yesterday's operation, and we are doing things in a military area, things we find necessary to reach the goals of the operation. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that unlike the Ukrainian government armed forces in Donetsk and Lugansk republics, we do not conduct any military actions, any bombardments, etc., against the Ukrainian cities. So the operation does not direct it against the Ukrainian people. We work only on military facilities of Ukrainian army and nationalist units deployed in the eastern part of Ukraine. And then again, I would like to remind you that it was the Ukrainian government forces who used air force, who used heavy armaments against their own citizens, against the Ukrainian citizens in the eastern part of Ukraine, the citizens who did not accept and had all rights to not accept the illegal regime change in Kiev in February 2014. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's start from the floor now. Khaldun has the first, then Andy.
Thank you, Ambassador, for coming again. Khaldun Azhari, Panorama News.
Nice to meet you.
My question is, how do you evaluate the relations between Russia and Japan at this stage, after Tokyo imposed more sanctions on your country and people? And where is the islands issue is now? We thought you will return the islands, but now it's kind of a dream for Japanese. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, of course, we read today's announcement by the Japanese government about what it called additional sanctions against Russia, and recently I have clearly told to the Japanese government, top-level government official, that first of all, these actions from the Japanese side will be responded. There will be a response from us. I suppose there will be a serious response from us. And I'm confident that taking such steps, the Japanese government does not contribute to the development of mutually beneficial and friendly relations between our countries, does not contribute to building up a positive atmosphere around our dialogue on very, very broad agenda we have together, including the peace treaty issue. And I also deeply regret that the Japanese government is taking counterproductive measures towards Russia and the Russia-Japanese relations under basing on really baseless pretexts of they put as an explanation for these kind of sanctions. Thank you.
Andy.
Hi, this is Andy Sharp from Nikkei Asia. Thank you for coming, Ambassador. I do appreciate you taking the time. Just a very short question. Obviously, you talk about defending the ethnic Russian people in the east of the country and the Russian language speakers. But, you know, reports I've seen overnight and mentioned by the Ukrainian ambassador this morning said that Russian forces have seized the Chernobyl power plant. Can you confirm this? And if you have done, please can you explain the rationale behind that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Andy, first of all. Yes, I saw information in the media saying that the Ukrainian side announced that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was taken by the Russian forces. At the moment, I cannot deny or confirm this information because I have not seen yet an official announcement from the Russian side with regard to this case. But I can assure you that everything will be done for safe and responsible handling of all the nuclear facilities that can be that can be or may be in the area of the activity of the Russian forces.
I think Greg was first and then Peter.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned the importance of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements call for autonomy in Donetsk and Lugansk, presumably for the oblasts, for the whole area. Your government has established republics in the area which should remain autonomous under the Minsk agreements. Can you resolve this contradiction for me?
Thank you, dear Gregory. First of all, within the 7 years that Russia, as a co-sponsor of the Minsk agreements, was trying to persuade the Kiev government to implement all the articles of the agreements. Within the same 7 years, the Ukrainian government was refusing to do so. And unfortunately, other co-sponsors, namely France and Germany, also failed to persuade the Kiev government to implement these agreements. More to this, in cruel violation of the Minsk agreements, the Kiev government deployed huge troops and heavy weaponry on the contact line. And finally, again, in cruel violation of the Minsk agreement in the end of last week, started a large-scale attack on the positions of the two republics. And actually, that is when we realized that the Kiev regime does not only want to implement Minsk agreements, but we realize that it wants to make a third attempt to settle the problem by force, following two attempts back in 2014 and 15 that were a complete failure, and after which Minsk agreements were signed. And also, Kiev government didn't implement, in fact, many of the articles, if not all the articles, of this agreement. First of all, the Kiev government refused to establish dialogue with the what was called in the Minsk agreements as particular districts of Lugansk and Donetsk regions. There was no amnesty, there was no exchange of prisoners of war, there was no elections under the control of the OEC, etc. So it was the Kiev government's policy that in fact killed the Minsk agreements. And this created a completely new situation. A new situation when the two regions asked Russia to recognize them as independent states, and taking into account the 7 years of sabotage of these agreements by Kiev authorities, and taking into account 7 years of genocide conducted by the Kiev authorities against the population of Donetsk and Lugansk republics, a decision was made in Moscow to recognize them as independent states. Thank you.
Thank Peter.
It's Peter Langan at the South China Morning Post. President Putin is, as you indicated already at the press conference, has said that there was a fear that Ukraine was trying to develop a nuclear deterrent, nuclear weapon. But Ukraine, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, gave up its nuclear weapons in an agreement with Washington and Moscow to return, well, in return for the safety of its borders or security of its borders. So can you provide us with any kind of evidence that Russia has that there has been an attempt to procure or develop nuclear weapons within Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. The problems related to the nuclear weapons are too serious, and that is why we pay attention, we have to pay attention as a responsible nuclear power state. We have to pay attention to any signal nuance, even in the rhetoric of the foreign countries regarding the nuclear weapons. As you well know, from the Kyiv side, on the official level, the hints were made, the statements were made in favor of obtaining nuclear weapons. And this is a very, very dangerous and clear indication of the intentions of the current regime in Kyiv. That is what we could not ignore as a responsible member of the NPT and as a nuclear power. Thank you.
I think Sergei was there, and then Karen.
Sergei Mingashev, Russian State Television. Speaking about Japanese sanctions, when 8 years ago, when Japan joined to the West, many people said that Japanese sanctions were soft, more like nominal. Is it different today? How is it different today? And can you give us some details? What is the Japanese contribution to weakening Russia's economy? For example, Russia is banned to sell its sovereign debt. So how much is it? How much of this sovereign debt has been sold to Japanese countries, or this freezing of assets of financial institutions and individuals? Who are those individuals? How much is it? How tens, hundreds of millions, billions? And you said that Russia is preparing response, and you said it will be very serious. Can you share some details? What kind of response might it be? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sergei. At the moment, I only heard the official statement from the Japanese government, which says about the key elements of what it calls sanctions against Russia. They gave no details. So I don't know about these details, and that is why I apologize, but I cannot respond in detail to a question about how much of damage there will be for Russia. But I definitely know that there will be damage for both sides, for those who impose sanctions and for those who are imposed sanctions. That is one point. And so it is mutually unbeneficial step. And frankly, I wonder why the G7 governments are so responsive to the U.S. demands. Frankly, I hoped to see more independent and autonomous policy from these countries. Then, because the purpose set by the United States with regard to the sanctions against Russia is actually not related to Ukraine or to any other concrete international issue. It is related to the US strategy to weaken Russia, as President Biden has just said while announcing sanctions or before announcing sanctions, the current package of sanctions. This goal itself is quite toxic and unachievable, because it is not possible to oust Russia, to exclude Russia from the world economy. And that is what Mr. Biden and his administration try to aim at, try to seek for, and this cannot be characterized as a responsible approach to the world economy, especially in the days, in current period, when we should unite our economic potentials and our economic competences to struggle the economic decline caused by COVID-19 disease infection. The aim of the United States, which was regretfully supported by other members of so-called G7 mechanism, is very, very much counterproductive for the world economy, taking into account the role and place of Russia in world economic mechanisms. First of all, as a responsible supplier of vitally important energy resources. By the way, vitally important also for Ukraine. Of course, Russia will respond, but how it will respond, I cannot, of course, elaborate at the moment. But I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Russia, for the recent 40 years maybe, have clearly proven that it is a reliable and responsible exporter of energy resources that are vitally important for the European economies, for Japan's economy, for Ukrainian economy, and we have proven it, despite the fact that during, especially the recent years, we have been, for many times, a subject for illegal, baseless, and really absurd sanctions from the West. Unlike Ukraine, who would steal our gas designed for the Western European consumers from the pipelines which is going through its territory, we have always been strictly adhere to our international obligations. That is just to describe our position with regard to the world economy in general and with regard to Mr. Biden's wish to weaken Russian economy. And what kind of sanctions, what kind of response we will make? Well, in proper time there will be proper announcements about this, I think. Thank you.
Ambassador, since we are talking about economic impact and sanctions, let me jump to the online questions. There are two questions that are related to this subject. I know that you already kind of answered, but it's my role to forward the questions.
Good.
So the first one is from Anthony Rowley, also from South China Morning Post. Financial sanctions against Russia do not appear to be very severe, at least up to now. Could you comment a little bit more about this? And the second one is related to the other, Motoko Rich from New York Times. What kind of serious response might Russia take against Japan for imposing sanctions?
Well, first of all, about first question from the South China Morning Post about the severe or not that severe nature of the financial sanctions. Again, I cannot judge at the moment the extent of damage from these kind of sanctions, but I can definitely say that they are mutually unbeneficial. They would be mutually unbeneficial if imposed, and that in my view, the problem is not only in the content of this or that sanction. The problem is that the Western states, headed by the United States of America, they are confident in their exclusiveness, in their superiority, or what they call superiority, in their infallibility to punish, as they say again, to punish those who would not agree with their policy, who would seek their national interests independently. And this is the problem for not only for Russia, or rather than for Russia, this is a problem for the whole international community. Because such a boorish behavior as to try to punish by sanctions those who dare pursue independent policy which would not necessarily coincide with the interests with the West. This kind of behavior, this kind of international behavior is irresponsible and is very dangerous, for the international order based on the UN Charter. That is the problem. It's not only about what kind of damage Russia will suffer or what kind of damage will suffer those who imposed the sanctions. Thank you. Oh, yes, second question.
Yes.
Well, I can only repeat to the New York Times that in proper time, I think our countermeasures are going to be announced. Thank you.
Karin?
Thank you for coming. My name is Karine Nishimura from French Libération newspaper and Radio France radio station. My question is, what is your final goal in Ukraine? And when you will reach this final goal, will you stop the operation? Or is there any other country you think as a threat for Russia? Thanks.
Thank you, Karin. I think President Putin was clear enough to when he explained in his speech on the 24th of February that there are several goals of our operation in Ukraine. The first is to protect citizens of Lugansk and Donetsk republics who suffered genocide from the Kiev regime. One more is to defend the security interests of Russia, which were greatly damaged and which are still greatly jeopardized by the expansion of NATO from 16 states back in 1991 to 30 states at the moment, and all new members of the NATO were from Eastern Europe, from what we call post-Soviet republics, and from the Balkan states, namely the countries very, very close to Russia. So now Russia is, the NATO is at our gates. The NATO, which first of all, considers Russia as an opponent or as an enemy, which is very dangerous itself. Then, maybe I have already mentioned this in this whole. Then NATO, as maybe no other international organization, has a long list of aggressive actions against the sovereign states. Look what the NATO did in former Yugoslavia back in 1999. It was actually a big war in Europe, which led to the change of status quo by force. And nobody in the NATO, in the European continent at that time, didn't raise their voices against this kind of aggression conducted in apparent violation of international law and the UN Charter, and in apparent ignorance of the role of the United Nations Security Council. And this aggression led to the division of Yugoslavia and illegal proclamation of so-called independence of so-called independent state Kosovo. More to this, back in, if we enter the 21st century, they were such cruel and destructive aggressions conducted by the United States and their NATO allies, like in Iraq, like in Libya, like now in Syria, where the NATO troops are deployed without any permission from the United Nations Security Council or from the legitimate government of Syria. And all these aggressions resulted in very, very negative, very, very heavy results for the region, for the respective regions, and for the international community in general. Look what happened in Iraq. Our goal is to protect our security interests against the background of expansion of such a dangerous organization as NATO, so closely to our borders. And again, this organization started military exploration of neighboring Ukraine, supporting the most radical, the most extremist and neo-Nazi sentiments in the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian state, and Ukrainian society. That is what we won't tolerate anymore. So this is our goal, namely demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. I think it's clear, as the Russian officials have already announced, the further future of Ukraine will depend on the choice of the Ukrainian people, of demilitarized and denazified Ukraine. Thank you.
We have questions? Jimbo.
Hello, Teddy Jimbo with the videonews.com. Just a follow-up question on the Minsk agreement. The President Putin already said that it no longer exists. So is that Russia's official position that Minsk, Russia is actually abandoning this Minsk agreement? And if that's the case, and since you mentioned the preventing expansion of NATO is one of the purpose of the operation, does that mean that the ceasefire of the current military conflict requires Ukrainian government agreeing not to join NATO for the ceasefire condition. And if if Minsk agreement no longer exists, I suppose you will need a new agreement. Who will be the involved party? Who do you foresee are the involved party in the new agreement to establish the ceasefire? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Harry. Well, first of all, it is not Russia who abandoned, as you said, the Minsk agreements. It is the Ukrainian government who actually abandoned this agreement almost immediately after signing it. And that is really a problem, because for 7 years we tried, without having any productive assistance from other co-sponsors like France and Germany. We were trying to persuade the Ukrainian government to implement Minsk agreements, but there was no result, because due to the very, very much, let's say, unfriendly position of the Kiev government, and as a result of really absence of political will in Kiev to implement this agreement. So that is not I understand that there is sort of a fashion to announce anything as a result of Russian actions, but in this case it's not Russia who killed this agreement. Then you asked about the future, I mean, about the future developments with regard to the special military operation in Ukraine. Well, it does not depend only on us, what is going to happen next. We, of course, would prefer to see responsible attitude towards our initiatives, towards our proposals, towards our ideas, which we have presented during recent decades for many times. But unfortunately, we haven't yet seen such a responsible agreement. We have seen only NATO expansion and empty chats, empty talks about regional security with no result. So, we have not seen yet the true observance of the principle of the indivisibility of security, which I mentioned above. Thank you.
Lady there, yes.
Hi, thank you, Ambassador. My name is Haruyo Miyamoto from Tokyo Broadcasting System. Thank you. My question is regarding your special operation that's undergoing in Ukraine right now. You say that's a special operation to demilitarize and to liberate the people of Ukraine from the Nazis. That's the explanation, basically, I understand. But if Russia succeeds in this operation, if it succeeds in liberating Ukraine, do you think the people in Ukraine, not only in the Donbas area, but in Kiev and in western part of Ukraine, do you think the people in Ukraine will accept your government's decision and will be welcoming President Putin's decision? What do you think?
Thank you so much, Ms. Miyamoto. We declared very clearly that our goals are to protect people in Lugansk and Donetsk republics, then to protect our national security interests, and to demilitarize and to denazify Ukraine. After that, the decision will be made not by us. It will be made by the Ukrainian people. And I don't, at the moment, I cannot predict what kind of decision will be made by the Ukrainian people. But what, as President also mentioned in his speech on the 24th of February. What we think is that the will of the Ukrainian people may be expressed after our operation in a more in a freer atmosphere, not in an atmosphere of orchestrated and decorated so-called elections that have taken place in Ukraine recently, under the huge pressure from the rightist movements, under the huge pressures from nationalist, illegal nationalist armed groups, and from those, unfortunately, very strong forces in Ukraine, in current Ukraine, that glorify Nazi collaborationists as heroes. So we hope that after our operation, the Ukrainian people will have a chance for really free expression of its will. Thank you.
Ambassador, I have two questions online from Ilgin Yorulmaz, BBC World Turkish. Let me ask them one by one because they are totally unrelated. The first one is, Ukraine has requested Turkey to consider to invoke the article in 1936 Montreux Conference that allows Turkey to ban passage of military ships through the Bosphorus Strait. Soviet Union was a signatory at that time. What is Russia's point of view on this Ukrainian request?
Well, I haven't seen our official reaction on this particular information of the media about the Ukrainian request. But my reaction is that Russia, as a state that continues the international obligations of the Soviet Union legally, Russia, of course, as a party of the Montreux Convention, of course, Russia proceeds from the point that pacta sunt servanda and the international obligations, international agreements should be kept, should be implemented fully. Thank you.
Thank you. The second question is a more general one. What kind of legacy does your President Putin want to leave behind him when he will retire one day? Someone who stopped the NATO at its borders and revived somehow former Soviet Union, or someone who started a new war in Europe after the end of World War II?
Well, I will...
we should ask Putin, of course, but...
yes, of course. That's what I wanted to say in final part of my question, of my answer. Thank you so much, Pio, for anticipating correctly. First of all, I would like to just express my opinion that a new war in Europe was started not by Russia now. Russia is not waging a war in Ukraine. It is special military operation, let's be correct. The war in Europe was waged by the above-mentioned NATO back in 1999, when NATO conducted an unprovoked military aggression against a sovereign state, a member of the United Nations, in cruel violation of the UN Charter and without having any permission from the UN Security Council, which is a body exclusively responsible for international peace and security in accordance with the UN Charter. So it's not Russia who started the war. You asked me about legacy of my president. I would like you just to objectively assess what has been done in Russia, both with regard to its domestic and economic policy and foreign policy, during the period when President Putin, when Vladimir Putin was either president or the or prime minister of Russia. There was a great progress in many areas, and there was a great strengthening of Russian position in international affairs as a very responsible power, which contributes greatly to world peace and security. And I just taking into account that Pio has already said very valuable words, I would like just to say that President Putin's mission has not completed yet. He's continuing, fulfilling his duty as the President of Russia, as Commander-in-Chief of Russian Armed Forces, as the leader of our nation, and of course, and I'm sure that there will be new success under the leadership of President Putin. Thank you.
Well, I know that your president is very active on Zoom, so maybe you can help us to have him on Zoom and answering this question at the next occasion.
Let's try, why not?
Okay, I think that we are wrapping up now. It's time is, allow me, as usually, the last question. I think that most of us, including you and me, have been born under a bipolar system coming after the World War. And then we witnessed a period of a unipolar system, the American being the only superpower. Do you think that this era is over forever, that American, so-called American order is finished, and now we have at least a tripolar situation, China, Russia, and America?
Well, we in Russia think that we are now all, whether anybody likes it or not, we are living in a multipolar world. Yes, there was a period when the West, headed by the United States, might feel its exclusiveness and its exclusive right to so-called right, alleged right to decide about the international order. How should it be? But this time has already passed because new centers of political, economic, and military power are emerging. And this is what should be taken into account by the United States and its Western allies, that the world has changed and changed dramatically. And there will be no situation, in my view, in foreseeable future, that the United States could unilaterally decide, could unilaterally make decision on this or that problem, on this or that issue. There should be a collective, in present-day world, when we all face the problems that cannot be handled, that cannot be solved by one single country, no matter how powerful it is. We should more and more rely on collective mechanisms of settling international issues. And of course, the most universal and the most the most responsible, the most authorized is the United Nations. But at the same time, we see the apparent growth of role and effectiveness of G20 mechanism, where all main countries are represented, including BRICS states, for instance, including above-mentioned G7 and other largest economies of the world. In our view, there will be no place for this kind of aggressive unilateral approach exercised by the United States, which the United States and the NATO try to exercise even these days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much, everybody. You have now a break of a couple of hours. I hope to see you all here again for the last third of the day. The American Ambassador Emmanuel Ram is coming. So thank you very much, Ambassador,
Thank you, Piero. Thank you.
for coming again. I hope to welcome you and your Canadian guest again at the end of this.
Okay.
Very soon, I hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Piero. Thank you.